Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Central Podcasting Unit. This is your host, Liam, in the office here with Noah.
Yeah, you are.
Great, Noah. Back at it again with the awkward introduction.
We are never going to get better at that.
We're not, and I hope we don't. So here we are. It's week 6 of the Central Podcasting Unit, episode 5. Hard to believe that we're on week 6.
It's wild.
It is wild.
It is very wild.
Yeah. We have what I think is going to be a really interesting episode for you guys today. We're going to be talking about open source programs. And beyond that, I have no idea what we're going to be talking about because Noah did all the work, did all the research for this episode, and he's going to be presenting the information to me as well as you. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, should be some fun.
However, before we get into that, there is one thing I want to go over very briefly. So as we had stated back in episode 1, one of the big things we want to do with this podcast is we want to be presenting information in a way that's explicitly relevant to you, to the average person. And that's both presenting information in a way that's relevant to you, but also presenting relevant information to you or going over big current events and news. And so one of the big current events going on right now in technology news is regarding social media companies and the government. And so essentially what had happened is yesterday, which for us is Wednesday, and for you, well, it's Wednesday. So on Wednesday, on Wednesday, what had happened is the Twitter had marked a post by the president as containing false information, and the president did not like that Twitter did that. So the president had at that time indicated that he would like to do something, that he would like to alter in some way the way that social media companies operate. Mm-hmm. And so what had happened is the end of that day, we learned that there was an executive order the president was planning to do something about that. And today, actually within just a few minutes before this episode, within an hour or so before we started recording this episode, that executive order was signed. And I'd like to just very briefly go over this executive order because it is relatively confusing. And I just want to talk about how it's going to kind of affect you as the average American. So what this executive order does is it is essentially asking various parts of the executive branch, primarily the FCC and the FTC, to take a look at the way that social media companies operate, primarily in regards to liability and in regards to privacy, and look at ways that these regulations could be altered. And so specifically what's kind of being looked at here is right now as it stands is social media companies are not liable for what's posted on their websites.
Sure.
And that's been the point of controversy as well because a lot of information with varying degrees of truth has been posted on social media and continues to be posted on social media. And so essentially what would happen if anything were to change is that by marking something as being false information, for example, a social media company would have to take the liability that comes with that post. So if you posted something that could lead you to be sued for defamation, for example, and a social media company marked that as being fake information, they would then be liable because they changed your post, because they edited your post and they did something to your post. They now assume responsibility for the post as well. So that's kind of what's being looked at is, can we do something along those lines? What would this look like legally and so on and so forth? So it's not actually anything happening. It's just looking at the legality of how are social media companies being regulated now, and in what way could that be changed? and what would that look like if they're changed. So essentially, right now it's really exploratory. The executive order is very exploratory, and it's not necessarily going to change anything for you or for the way that social media companies operate. It's just directing the government essentially to reevaluate the way that social media companies have been allowed to run.
Okay.
And see whether they will continue to be allowed to run in that way, or if there's going to be changes to their liability depending on if they're editing or altering posts without the owner's consent, essentially.
Okay.
So trying to present that in as an unpolitical way as possible, and I think I did a relatively okay job. So that's all we're really going to say about that executive order. That's not the most in-depth explanation. It's a very basic explanation of kind of what's going on with the executive order. And somebody may have, a bit of a different interpretation than I did when I kind of just did my research and read through the executive order. So if you do have any different ideas or something like that, let me know. But I think that should give you a pretty good idea upon which you can found your own opinion on about the executive order.
Yep. I had no idea about most of what was going on there, so you explained it pretty well for me.
So with that being said, let's jump into the actual topic of today's episode. Cut short, unfortunately, a little bit because of my little excerpt, but we're going to be talking about open source software.
Cool. So software in general, your general, if you say downloaded Microsoft Word, something like that, that's your computer software, right? So with software, there's two different kinds of software that you can download: proprietary or closed source software and open source software. Proprietary software means that only the original authors can edit the source code. Now, the difference being that with open source software, the source code is something that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. That's coming from the open source project.
So what is source code?
Getting to that right now. So I knew you were going to ask that question, so I prepared it. Source code is code that is created by a programmer that can easily be read and understood by another programmer or human being. So the programming language C++ is a form of source code. Binary is not a form of source code.
Really?
Yes. Yeah, because we can't read binary as humans.
So to provide an example, right? Right now, I'm messing around in Unity, and for those of you that don't know, Unity is a game engine that games are built in. And so, if I were to say, allow people to see my code as I'm developing a game, which I'm not because I suck. But if I didn't suck and I was actually developing a game and throughout that process and upon the completion, I allow people to kind of see most aspects, if not all aspects of my code, that would make it open source.
That's the concept, but there's actually 10 rules there's 10 factors that make a program open source, and we'll go into that in a minute.
Okay.
Yes, there are.
More you know.
Yes. Yeah. So there's 10 factors and we'll that make a piece of software open source. We'll get into that. So open source software in many cases is free to use.
Sure.
There are some cases, like in the case of Red Hat Linux, where the software is open source but not necessarily free. Open source and free do not mean the same thing.
Sure. They just typically combine, but it doesn't have to be
exactly. That way. A good way to think of it is that free software is almost always open source.
Yep.
But open source software is not always free.
Okay. It's like the square and the rectangle.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. So a common misconception of open source software is that it can be unsecure, right? You know, that's why a lot of people don't
free
like to
software. The code is out there; anybody can see it, access it, and so on and so
but
forth.
That actually works in its advantage because we have so many eyes on that code. it's very hard for somebody to slip in a malicious, something malicious that's going to steal your data or something like that, because somebody's going to kind of throw a flag, to use a sports term there, throw a flag, blow a whistle, something like that, and say, hey, this isn't okay.
So if there is something going on, people are going to be able to identify that, and even people would be able to potentially get rid of it.
Exactly. So it's very hard to insert something malicious into those programs.
But that's also why, for example, you should only download these programs from the trusted download location, right?
Yep. Yep. So now getting into that point, here are the 10 actual requirements for software to be open source. This is coming from the Open Source Initiative. So the first thing that they list is that there needs to be free redistribution.
Really?
Meaning that there's no restrictions. It doesn't have to be free.
Okay.
But there's no restrictions on redistributing. So if I were to say take a piece of code and modify it,
yep,
I'm free to redistribute that as I like.
Gotcha. So, for example, typically when you buy, if I buy a game, right? So if I buy a game, I typically don't have the rights to redistribute that game to somebody else. But say if a game was open source, I could buy the game, modify it slightly, and then resell it. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Kind of. I'm not a lawyer. Don't. Kind of.
But essentially, maybe not resell it, but I would be able to provide my alternative as an alternative.
Yes, exactly. And one big point, an open source license means that there's no royalty required to redistribute that.
Gotcha.
You don't have to pay a royalty for each purchase.
So there's no it in order for software to be open source, it has to be able to be distributed by the people that say purchase it.
Exactly.
But there's still a license that kind of regulates that agreement.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So the source code. So the next big point is the source code. The program needs to include source code and allow the redistribution of the source code and the compiled code. Source and compiled code is kind of before and after.
Okay.
So your source code is, what we program in. Your compiled code is your after and how the computer the computer
interprets it,
exactly.
and so on and so forth.
Yep, exactly. And if the source code is not included in the application, if you can't access it, there needs to be a public way to access it for no charge.
Interesting.
And you can't make the code purposely. You can't obscure your code purposely.
Sure. I feel like just kind of going over this, I feel like there's a lot of programs that claim they're open source but aren't because of these requirements.
Maybe. Maybe. But when somebody releases a software development kit, an SDK,
yes,
that is their way of making it open source. The kind of allowing the code to be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. So that's their way of doing it.
Sure.
So Derived Works, this means that you're allowed to modify and create new forms of it.
Sure.
And the license must allow for the new creations to be distributed under the same terms of the original software.
Okay, so that does mean you could sell it.
You can.
Okay. Big I anal right here. Big I am not a lawyer.
Yeah, I am not. I am not a lawyer. I am not a lawyer. Do your own research. Draw your own conclusions.
Sure.
Okay, but according to this, you are allowed to modify and resell. But
I feel like that should just be the name of this episode of the podcast.
I am not a lawyer.
I am not a lawyer.
I am not a lawyer. Okay. However, for a moment, I do want to say it makes it kind of hard when, say, if you take that source code and you modify it and sell it, but Joe Schmo over there created it and is just giving it away for free, or modified it in a similar way and is just giving it away for free. So I think that's kind of their way of not regulating it.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. So that's kind of how I see that. So point number 4, is named the integrity of the author's source code. And it says that the license, the terms that they use are that the license may restrict source code from being distributed in modified form only if the license allows distribution of patch files. Essentially, you can't change the entire thing and just make it something brand new. You have to modify it. You have to keep
basically it has to have the same identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Point number 5, no discrimination against persons or groups.
Sure.
It's pretty self-explanatory. Yep. Don't be a jerk.
Yep.
It's got to be available to everybody.
To everyone. Yep.
Number 6, no discrimination against fields of endeavor. You can't just market it, or you can't just say, if you have a business, you can use this, and the general consumer can't.
Shoot.
I know, right? So you're not allowed to do that.
Again, relatively self-explanatory.
Yep. Number 7, distribution of license. The rights attached to the program must apply to to everybody that downloads it.
Don't be a pain in the butt.
Exactly.
Don't be mean about it.
Yeah, exactly. Number 8, license must not be specific to a product.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, no. And this one was hard to I made a lot of these. I shortened a lot of these to just what it is, but this one I kind of need to read verbatim.
Yeah, go for it.
So, verbatim, what this is saying is that the rights attached to the program must not depend on the program's being part of a particular software distribution. If the program is extracted from that distribution and used or distributed within the terms of the program's license, all parties to whom the program is redistributed should have the same rights as those granted in conjunction with the original software distribution.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So, for example, when you download a program like, honestly, I think even when I was downloading Adobe Acrobat, I think Adobe Acrobat comes with like McAfee or something bundled into it.
Yeah.
And basically what that's saying is that if McAfee was an open source program and I was downloading Adobe and it came with McAfee, the McAfee license would still apply even if the Adobe license tried to say something different.
Exactly.
In order for it to be an open source, because it's an open source program, its license supersedes any license it might be bundled with.
Exactly.
Okay.
Number 9, license must not restrict other software. So the license, it's kind of like the flip of that, right?
Yeah.
It's not allowed to restrict other software that is distributed along with that the license for that software.
So like if I download McAfee and say McAfee's open source, McAfee's license can't say don't use WebRoot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say don't use 2 antiviruses at the same time.
Oh, jeez. Jeez Louise, partner. Please no.
We'll get into that, but it's a bad time.
An antivirus episode, that would be a megasode if we do a megasode.
Absolutely.
I also really want to hear people's feedback. Again, please provide feedback. We're always open to hearing feedback. So far, we've heard a lot of good feedback, which is a good thing. But if you have negative feedback, please feel free to provide that as well. Because, for example, our megasode, I don't know if you've noticed, is significantly less in terms of its view numbers than our shorter episodes. So we really want to we have a lot of good ideas for like a megasode, like for example, talking about antiviruses. We want to do one on Linux, stuff like this, but would you like that as a megasode or do you want it in 2 smaller podcasts or 3 smaller podcasts, So please make sure to provide that feedback. Again, either on YouTube, on Facebook is a really big place, and also on our website, theoretically, we should have blog posts coming up for the podcast episodes on our website.
Fingers crossed.
Our website is up. However, we have some stuff going on, which we will talk about a little later to not get completely sidetracked, that may prevent that necessarily from going up on time.
Because we have our last point here. In order for so number 10.
Yep.
Last rule for software to be open source: the software must be technology neutral.
Technology neutral. What does that mean?
So, verbatim, this says that no provision of license may be predicated
Predicated sounds
predicate.
much more right.
Yeah, it does. Predicated on any individual technology or style of interface. Essentially meaning it's got to be available. As I'm interpreting that, it means it's got to be available to to anyone. Really, the point of it being open source.
Sure. Yeah, that went over my head.
Yeah. The way that I'm interpreting that
Yep.
is that, hey, you have a Mac, you can't download this software.
Oof.
That's kind of the way I'm interpreting that.
That's not something I would do. Don't look at me, you Mac user.
Liam does not like Macs, for the record, folks.
I don't. My God, I could do a whole episode about why I don't like Apple and why I don't like iOS and why I don't like Mac OS.
Possible Macasode.
A
Love that.
Macasode.
Okay. So to wrap it all up, I'm going to give you some examples of some open source software
Sure.
that you may or may not be familiar with.
Sure.
And these are just some they're really just great alternatives. They're trusted to like your general,
I'm ready.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
programs.
I'm
So
entranced.
the first one, you're going to hate this. It's LibreOffice.
Oh my God. Do yourself a favor and buy Microsoft Office or use Google Drive.
But for the general consumer who maybe can't be online all the time or can't, or doesn't have the money to spend on a Microsoft Office subscription, LibreOffice is a really great option for you.
All right, before we continue, here's what I will say, okay? I don't like it, but if you're a casual user, you don't want to spend money, you're not always online, sure, you download your LibreOffice, you're fine. This is what I will say, though. If you're a business, take the plunge.
Don't skimp.
When it comes to websites and branding, you don't want to skimp as a business. And one of the things I see a lot of businesses do is skimp on their software. And they use cheap or free software in places where they shouldn't. Because while LibreOffice is free and it is trusted, and to an extent it is quality, it is not the same quality as Microsoft Word. And when you're in a business environment and you need to do things like, for example, headers, you want quality. I actually have some real world testimonial of an employee complaining to me about how their company doesn't provide them with a good enough word processor. They use LibreOffice, and that employee has to alternate between their own privately owned word processor, their own privately owned software to get work done because their employer doesn't give them the tools. If you're a casual use, LibreOffice, but if you are in that professional setting, take the plunge. It will be worth it for your business and for your employees. I'm sorry, I just hate LibreOffice in a professional setting because there are people in our positions as IT consultants for businesses that will tell them they can't get away with LibreOffice. And I just don't think that's right.
No, I agree. You really should be using an actual word processor if you're a business. But if you're like a high school student or something, I would say if you don't want to, drop the money on Office 365 or something like that, or it's not a bad option.
There are places I would argue as a business you shouldn't skimp, and as IT professionals. Obviously, we argue technology is one of those places you shouldn't skimp, and software is definitely included with that.
Absolutely.
I'm so sorry to hijack that. What's the next one?
The next one is GIMP. It's a GNU image manipulation program. It's a Photoshop alternative.
It's a Photoshop alternative, and it's clunky, but it's fantastic, and it gets the job done. And
Absolutely,
it's free.
It's free. It's free. I use it a lot.
I use it too.
Yeah, it's great. It really is a great.
But
program.
Again, that's like one of those things where like, if you wanted to be a YouTuber or you had to do a lot of, I'm so sorry. If you had to do a lot of art editing, I had Burger King before this episode, so that's
you're fired.
Great. I always wanted to be. If you are going to be doing a lot of art editing, again, don't skimp.
Mm-hmm.
GIMP is great for casual, but if you're going to be doing a lot, if you're going to be doing a lot of intricacies, that's where it really starts to fall apart. And I know that's I think you've been having some aggravations with it because of that reason.
Oh yeah, but once you start to get used to it, like any software, it gets better. But again, don't skimp. If you do any professional photo editing, don't skimp. Okay, next one, VLC Media Player. Are you familiar with VLC?
VLC is fantastic.
Absolutely.
VLC, because audio, there's a lot of video files specifically that for whatever reason the default media player software on a computer just cannot read, and VLC is the go-to solution. I think to an extent, even in most semi-professional to low professional settings, VLC is also that solution because of how good it is at what it does.
As somebody who edits video quite a bit for various jobs that I've done, I really enjoy using VLC, especially when I'm taking different types of files and trying to read them all. And when you have those big raw files too that not every video player can read, perfect for that.
As somebody that thought they could be a Minecraft YouTuber in middle school, I also liked VLC.
Great, we have all spectrums. That's awesome. The next one on the list is Audacity. We're actually using Audacity to record this podcast, and we have been for a while. It's a great tool.
Yeah, we skimp. We're hypocrites.
But I would argue that in this instance, this isn't skimping because
Sure.
Audacity, if you know what you're doing, is a very powerful tool.
Sure.
It's really great for removing like background buzz or something like that, background noise,
Sure.
isolating tracks, and just being able to
Very basic audio editing.
Exactly.
Like what you might need if you want to do your own podcast.
Exactly. And it's great. It's a really great program. It'll do everything, and it even has a vocoder.
Yep.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yep.
I love Audacity. And the final one is Linux.
Yep.
Linux is open source, and it's an entire operating system with many different distributions. It's awesome.
I just got my first Linux computer. So I have in this economy, I've had to pick up a second job, and because of that second job, it's an IT job. So
You're fired.
What can I say? We have Basileus. We're doing work with Basileus, and I'm doing some additional work on the side with a company that we work very closely with. And for that position, I have a Linux computer, and I love it. I'm using Linux Mint. And if I had to describe it, it's like Windows and Mac OS had a baby. It's the functionality and user interface I love out of Windows with the look of Mac OS, but sleeker in my opinion. So you can do some really cool stuff with Linux because that's just one version of Linux. But for example, Linux Cinnamon is very much Mac OS.
It's
like
yes.
So there's various different types of Linux, but Linux is awesome, and a lot of things that you know and you like, for example, run on Linux. So, for example, Netflix's servers are all Linux based, and so Linux is a platform built off of Linux. Netflix is a platform built off of Linux.
Now, I would almost say that if you're using Linux, you're not necessarily skimping.
No. Linux is its whole different beast. If anything, depending on what you're doing, using Mac OS or Windows might be skimping.
Potentially. It depends on your application.
It depends on your application, but there is definitely an instance where you could definitely argue that Linux is, in some instances, surpassing other operating systems. But, for example, you'd be skimping with a free operating system if you want to be gaming, for example.
Exactly. Yeah, I would not recommend gaming on Linux. It's very hard to find games to play. With
that being said, however, this episode's run a little longer than we normally like our episodes to run. Had a bit of a, we talked about some current events right at the beginning and then went into the podcast. And let me guess, because this has been a trend with us in recording these podcasts. We didn't even get close to covering everything you wanted to, did we?
We actually covered everything for once.
Okay. Well, okay. Look at us. We're becoming professionals at this point.
Not in our intros, though. That's never going to change.
Well, I think with that, we're going to call it here. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode of the Central Podcasting Unit. Again, I am not a lawyer. Just want to reiterate that.
I am not a lawyer.
I think we had a fun time recording this episode. I hope you guys learned something. I know I learned something. And again, if you're just a casual user and you want to do something and you don't want to pay for the big free premium program, then you should be or consider using an open source program, because it's safe, it's free, and it's a just great way to do software.
I'm not a lawyer, but yes. With that being said, I think that's going to do it for us.
Perfect. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you later, guys.